graduated in 80.
Yeah, I left in 83.
Oh, in 83. Somehow I knew that. I don't know why I would know that.
I was kind of a notorious departure.
Was it?
Yeah, he went to seminary.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure.
And there was a profile in one of the magazines. So maybe you read it. So what are you doing here?
I
Sure. All right. I think actually works best like up as high as you can go.
Okay.
And then maybe do it on the other so it's I think that's kind of on the inside of
Go
your
right now. So, okay. Yep. Okay. Oh, it's right. I realized. Oh, okay. No, it's fine. No, it's fine. Whoa, okay.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Does everybody have a handout? We've got a few extra handouts. We've got a fantastic crowd. This is a lot. Okay. And I'm not really the forum committee knows that I don't really do formal introductions. And so I'm just going to let Father Ferlo, Dr. Ferlo, take it away. Go ahead.
That's great. That's great. Wow. You're all warming up the place, which is really great. I know Dante is like pretty esoteric, except he's not. And one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about this was that there is an extraordinary interest on the part of poets in the last 10 years of taking this poem and translating it. Now, when I say poem, this is vast. The Dante's Divine Comedy is 3 books. The Inferno, which is what everybody knows and assumes when you say Dante, you're going to talk about hell. But the best part is the middle part, which is called Purgatorio, the Purgatory, which is kind of a theme park of redemption. Dante sort of created a kind of a universe, a Dantesque universe of his own, where he imagines, he thought the globe was a globe, but he imagined that there was land only on the top of the globe and the rest was water. And when Satan fell from heaven, he fell right near, he fell into the center of the earth, sort of, and as he fell in the center of the earth, he made a cone, and that turned out to be the Inferno. And so he imagined Satan in ice, not fire, in ice, embedded at the center of the earth. But then there is a kind of a stream that goes beyond him. And of course, it's the other end of the globe, and so you end up upside down, but right side up. And when the earth was pushed through, a mountain appeared on the other end. And Dante imagined that as purgatory. And you remember Thomas Merton wrote a book called The Seven-Story Mountain. Some of you might remember. There's a lot of former Catholics like me in the room, so you might remember this stuff. The 7 stories were basically, if you were redeemed and you had repented and you ended up in purgatory, you spent a lot of time going up the mountain in circles, and each circle was one of the 7 deadly sins that you were going to be freed from. The worst at the bottom, which took it the longest, was pride. The least serious at the top was lust. I love that. Okay. And then, if you imagine, when you go through this fire wall at the top, you find yourself in the Garden of Eden. He planted the Garden of Eden at the top of this mountain. That's where Dante meets Beatrice, the woman he had fallen in love with and who had died, but she now is in heaven, and she now becomes his guide, and it's like science fiction. It's like a rocket. She takes him, and they shoot up into the spheres of the Elysium. It's an incredible vision. But I think what has attracted some really extraordinary poets to this poet is a couple of things. One is that Dante was exiled from Florence. If you go to Florence and someone says, this is where Dante lived, don't believe them. It's taken them still 750 years, and they're still trying to get his bones back from Ravenna, where he died, to Florence. But he was exiled from Florence and actually spent half of his adult life just wandering around Italy. So in some ways, this is a poetry about exile, about not being at home. And the other thing to say about it is that it's both deeply embedded in the politics of the day and always sort of transcends the politics of the day. So in one way, it's about these incredibly complicated wars between Florence and Pisa and Siena. Everybody was at war with everybody else. But it's also about, as you realize when you get to the purgatory, it's about the journey of the soul. It's about coming to terms with who you are and why you are. And he did this with language that is so evocative that poets like W.S. Merwin, like Seamus Heaney, feel like I can't write my poetry unless I come to terms with what he did with the language. So, does anybody speak Italian? Oh, good. Okay. I'm going to teach you a little Italian. Take your sheet. I want you to hear the Italian of the opening of this extraordinary journey of the soul. Now I'm hoping this works. By the way, I was just in Ravenna. He's buried in Ravenna, and they actually, the street he's on, they declared it Zona Dantesca, the Dante zone. And what it says is it's the zone of silence. So you go to his grave and no one's talking. You know, it's like, wow. It's like, the Italians know how to do saints. Okay, I'm going to do this from here. This is the opening. Just to show you. This is just a photograph of a local bookstore. It's just two of the 5 shelves devoted to Dante translations. It's extraordinary how many contemporary writers need to come to terms with this poet. So let's come to terms. There he is. I'm going to read this in Italian a little bit, and then we're going to look at the English and how people, why this is such both a challenge and a seduction to poets. And what you're going to do is I'm going to read 4 or 5 lines, and then so you can get a sense of the sound and the feel of it in the mouth, I'm going to have you repeat after me in Italian, okay? You ready? All right. This is how the poem begins. It begins in the middle of things. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, mi ritrovai per una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita. Ai, quanto a Dio qual era cosa dura sta selva selvaggia e aspra e forte, che nel pensiero rinnova la paura. Tante amara che poco è più morte, ma per trattare del ben che vi trovai, dirò delle altre cose che vo scorte. Look across your page on the piece. Midway in the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood, for the straight way was lost. Ah, how hard it is to tell what that wood was. Wild, rugged, harsh. The very thought of it renews the fear. It is so bitter that death is hardly more so. But to treat of the good that I found in it, I will tell of the other things I saw there. And we're launched for 3 huge volumes of what Dante, the poet, his imagined poet, whose name is Dante, experiences. It sounds great in English, but it just, this is prose. This is a scholarly translation by a guy named Charles Singleton, who single-handedly created Dante studies in America in the 20th century. But I want to look at this and show you how an Italian would say, why this is so hard for you as an English poet to deal with? How can you emulate what he does? First, let's try to say the first line together. Ready? I'll say it first, and you try it afterwards. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. Mi ritrovai in una selva oscura, che la diritta via era smarrita. Already you get a sense there's music here. Notice that diritta rhymes with smarrita. There's a couple of things to say. One is, first thing you notice that there's 3. It's said in 3 verses, 3 and 3 and 3 and 3 and 3. Dante is a Trinitarian writer. There are 3s everywhere in this poem. So, but there's more to it than that. He sort of invented this. It's called the terza rima. And what it does, it's sort of like Mark's gospel, as we were talking about. It keeps you moving. It keeps you moving. Look at the rhymes. You can do this in Italian is easy to rhyme because there's a lot of vowel endings, okay? Notice just the way this works. The word vita at the end of the first line rhymes with smarrita at the end of the third line. The second line does not rhyme with that. It's the word oscura But guess what that rhymes with? The first word, the last word of the fourth line. So we have vita smarita with oscura in the middle. But then oscura rhymes with dura and paura with forte in the middle. And forte rhymes with morte and scorte with trovai in the middle. You see what he's doing? It's a chain. You can't stop reading. You see what I'm saying? You know, he just keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. It's a journey, literally a journey of language itself. And there's more to it than this. There's more to it than that. The word smarita, which is a great word in Italian. Say it again. Smarita. Smarita. It means lost. But it means lost in a particular kind of way. I can't find my way. And so when he says the la dirita via, a smarita, an English language poet says, how am I going to do that? How can I, you know, these two words, dirita and smarita, don't exist in English. But how can I translate this to be faithful to the wordplay that he has here? So when Charles Singleton, who is this wonderful edition of that every scholar of Dante needs to read, it's in 6 volumes, he decided, I'm going to give a literal translation. He's not a poet, he's a scholar. So midway in the journey of our life, I found myself in a dark wood where the straight way was lost. Even go back to the second line, mi ritrovai, I found myself. I mean, it's a poem about literally being in the woods. So in some ways, it's kind of a narrative of how do you get when you're lost in the woods. But to find yourself there is also to find yourself. Mi ritrovai, I found myself. In other words, this is a poem about being lost and having to find your way to some sense of self, some sense of who you are and why you are. And so the wood, the selva oscura, the dark wood, becomes a kind of both a literal setting, but also how many times have anyone in this room ever felt lost in a dark wood? And to say that he's doing this nel mezzo del cammino della nostra vita, it's a midlife crisis. Mezzo della nostra vita is the middle of my life, which in Dante's day would have been considered to be 35, because we lived for 70 years and 10. I beat it. I'm 72. And so it's a poem about exile, about not feeling at home and needing to get home. It's a poem about self-knowledge, and as well as a poem about, well, in the end, it's about God's grace. All right, so you're a contemporary poet. The first poet in America to decide that he needed to translate this, and in fact, revived Dante studies in America, surprisingly enough, is Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. In Cambridge, in the 1860s, right after the Civil War, which itself is interesting, Longfellow decided he was going to translate the entire poem, and he collected a group of people around him to read Dante together. That was the beginning in America of now what is a tremendously powerfully, how to put it, a very distinguished convocation of Dante scholars, the Dante Society of America. So not only did this poem have a long reputation, but it seemed to intrigue Americans of Longfellow's generation after the Civil War. And so he translates it as if Longfellow were writing it. Who's ever read a poem by Longfellow? Come on, you went to high school, right? By the shores of Gitchigumi, you know Longfellow. So he's a very sort of regular poet. And that's what he does here. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Now, as I should have said, Italian verse, not only did Dante do this terza rima, where he linked all these things, Italian verse, English poetry, we do, you've all learned it, iambic pentameter. Da 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 da. Right? Da 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 da. When in the course of human events. Da 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 da. Italian doesn't do it that way. Italian doesn't count stresses, it counts syllables. Every line has 11 syllables. Try it. Let's test it. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita, 11, right? Mi ritrovai per una selva oscura. Notice the selva oscura, the Italians elido, so it's one sentence. It's one syllable. Selva oscura. It's all 11. It's on and on and on. So not only do you have these linked verses, you also have 11 syllables. Well, it doesn't work in English, so what do? Well, if you're a Longfellow, I found myself within a forest dark. All right, that's sort of regular verse. Da 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 da. For the straightforward pathway had been lost. I think that this part of Longfellow and his colleagues' attraction to this poem was the aftermath of the Civil War, where where for so many people the straightforward pathway had been lost. So he started it. Longfellow started it, and then it just kept going. If you look on your sheet, number 2, here's how he translated what we had said, spoken in Italian. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, where the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say what was this forest savage, rough, and stern, which in the very thought renews the fear. So bitter it is, death is little more. But of the good to treat, which there I found, speak will I of the other things I saw there. It's kind of prosaic, actually. It doesn't have the same kind of music that the Italian had. And of course, he has to make choices. Selva oscura. Selva is forest, oscura is shadowy. Forest savage doesn't quite do it. But it does evoke other kinds of forests, like the savage forest that Americans had to conquer as they moved west. Okay. All right, he's not the only one. Let's move to the 20th century. Robert Pinsky was the poet laureate of the United States for a while, and he was the poet laureate who got people in small towns to choose poems that they wanted to have, to sort of make poetry sort of available to us. And he has a translation of the Inferno that came out in 1994, which now you realize this is how a poet deals with having to take a poet as ancient and as respected as Dante and to actually enter into his language in a way that is idiomatic to your language. Here's Pinsky. Midway on our life's journey, I found myself, this is number 3 on your sheet, I found myself in dark woods, the right road lost. Say that out loud with me. The right road lost. The right road lost. He found an equivalent in English to la vita delita res marita. The right road lost. He has 3 accents. So he says, so the decision he made was not to try to make an equivalent, but to speak English. And so the 3 accents in a row take you by surprise. Midway on our life's journey, I found myself in dark woods, comma, you have to stop. The right road lost. To tell about those woods is hard, so tangled and rough and savage. They like that word, savage. That thinking of it now, I feel the old fear stirring. Death is hardly more bitter. What did he do with the terza rima? He says, they're not rhyming. Myself, tell, rough, feel, bitter, well. But they work. There was another thing to say about the terza rima, going back to another challenge for poets. If you go back to that first page, Not only were those rhymes in terza rima, with vita, smarita, oscura, dura, but if you look at the words that rhyme, they tell themselves a little story. So, what is the vita? What is your life? It's smarita. Your life is you're wandering. What is and oscura rhymes with dura, shadowy rhymes with tough, and forte, strong, rhymes with morte, death. You see why poets are intimidated by Dante. I mean, it's extraordinary craft in this work. And Pinsky is doing as best he can, using the resources that his English gives him. Next page is one of my favorite poets ever, Nobel Prize winning Seamus Heaney, who didn't read Dante until he was in middle age himself. He was by the way, Heaney, I don't know if you've heard of Heaney, is one of the great Irish poets of the 20th century. He recently deceased, but he is extraordinarily brilliant. And so he cut his eye teeth in middle age translating Dante, because he felt he needed to move ahead. And I'll tell you more in a minute, but look at what he did with the opening lines. In the middle of the journey of our life, notice that Dante said, nostra vita, everybody gets that. It's our life, not just my life, but our life. So he starts out by talking as if we're all part of this, but then he narrows it down to me. In the middle of the journey of our life, I found myself smarita, astray, in a dark wood, where the straight road had been lost sight of. Say that line with me. Where the straight road had been lost sight of. What did Winston Churchill say about sentences ending in prepositions? Why did he do this? I mean, this is a conscious choice on his part. Because your voice trails off. Your voice trails off. Where the straight road had been lost sight of. How hard it is to say. How hard it is to say what it was like in the thick of thickets. There's your selva oscura, the thick of thickets, and suddenly you're in you're in the western part of Ireland, okay? The thick of thickets. Say those two words together. Thick thickets. I mean, the word itself sort of creates the thicket it's talking about. In the thick of thickets, in a wood so dense and gnarled. Now that word does not exist in Italian, but it's a great English word. Word so dense and gnarled, the very thought of it renews my panic, which is not a word that Dante used, but it's a great word for this. Partly because also the god Pan inhabits woods, and so to be panicked is to be lost in the woods and about to be captured by Pan. This is how Heaney thinks, and this is how Heaney creates this piece. These are all men. There's a woman poet named Mary Jo Bang, who is extraordinary. There she is. And she, well, I'll read it to you. Stopped mid-motion in the middle of what we call our life. I looked up and saw no sky, only a dense cage of leaf, tree, and twig. I was lost. It's difficult to describe a forest. Savage, arduous, extreme in its extremity. I think, and the facts come back. Then the fear comes back. Death, I believe, can only be slightly more bitter. It's a whole different world, a whole different way of expressing, and it's much more colloquial, it takes much more about this, more about the sense than the style in this. And I just love the idea of what we call our life. Dante does not say that. Dante just says our life, la nostra vita. and Bang, who actually has interpreted them wrong. Because what we call our life is not our life. What we call our life is not our life. And so her whole translation is going to have that kind of odd, I wouldn't call it cynicism, but an odd kind of ironic distance from Dante, the great male canonical poet. She's now working on, she's published this, she published the Purgatorio, she's working on the Paradiso. Who knows what that's going to be like? Who knows what that's going to be like? What I want to do now is to say that not only do people translate Dante, but they also take Dante as a kind of a sort of tutelary ghost, especially if you're a poet who has both, poetry in these days is, unlike Dante's days, is a deeply secular thing. I mean, religious poets are hard to find these days. But how do you sort of still have a kind of religious sensibility that talks about life as a calling, like we heard today? What am I called to in this life? And of course, for poets, they think of poetry as in ancient days, poetry was a calling. You were called to speak beautiful truths. Okay. Well, what does that look like for Seamus Heaney? Is going to ask, what does that look like in 20th century Ireland during the Troubles, which is where he grew up? So he, when he went to Dante in the Middle Age, he was struggling with, he's from Northern Ireland, he's Catholic from Northern Ireland, but he does not want to be a poet of Catholic Northern Ireland and always have to talk about the Troubles. On the other, so he moves, he exiles himself to the Republic of Ireland. But he still has to grapple with this. He has to grapple with his own identity as a Northern Irish Catholic who has left it behind but can never leave it behind. So he found an episode in the Purgatorio, and I'm going to use W.S. Merwin's translation. It's a very famous episode. There he is. We're not ready for him yet. Oh, maybe we are. It's a very famous episode. There was Sicilian politics in the 14th century, completely crazy, chaotic. But there was a king named Manfredi, who tried to get to the throne in the kingdom of Naples and Sicily, but he was killed in battle. And not only was he killed in battle, but his bones were not allowed burial because he had been excommunicated by the Pope. And so no one knows where he's buried. And the thing that people do remember about him is that his head was slashed. W.S. Merwin. So Dante in Purgatorio meets Manfred, and this is what we it's on number 6. So the way this works is Virgil is his guide, and they're going up the mountain, and he keeps encountering groups of penitents. And this is a group of penitents that now includes this very strange figure. One of them began saying to Dante, "Whoever you are, turn your face as you are going. Think whether you ever saw me over there." I turned toward him and looked at him closely. He was fair-haired, beautiful, a noble expression, but a blow had split one of his eyebrows open. When I denied humbly that I'd never ever seen him before, he said, "Now look," and showed me a wound at the top of his breast. Then, smiling, he said, "I am Manfred." Well, there's a couple of echoes here going on. Wound here, wound here, wound here. We know about wounds in saving figures. But this is a kind of moment of odd recognition. Don't you know who I am? No, I don't know you. Here, now you do. Look at the wounds. What is this an echo of? I will not believe until I see the wounds in his hands. And this is what Thomas says to the disciples. So Dante is very cagey about this. He knows that this is going to echo this. Well, Heaney was really attracted to this moment. And what he did was, he did what many Irish pilgrims do, and he went to a place in Ireland called St. Patrick's Purgatory. It's in the west of Ireland. It's an island, and it's said that St. Patrick in the 3rd century actually worshipped there. So people go on penitential journeys to this shrine. They actually approach it on their knees for whatever purpose, to expiate sin, to call upon St. Patrick for help. Anyway, it's a pilgrimage site. And that's what it looks like. And that's what the Purgatorial Mountain looked like to Botticelli when he was doing the sketches of Dante. So Heaney decided to use this as the setting for a set of poems about his midlife crisis. That's what it looks like. St. Patrick's Purgatory. I love the Irish. I tell you what. I mean, it's really extraordinary. And you see, it goes way back. This is a 15th century map of all those little circles or places where you stop and make a prayer, and then you go to the next one and the next one. And it's rugged, and the weather's terrible, and it's so Catholic. Okay. So it was for Heaney, it was a great sort of place. So he set his poem, a series of poems, and he called it. It's the name of the poem. It's called Station Island, because each of those circles is a station. It's like the stations of the cross. So you would go from. So this is the Station Island, and he imagines himself making a pilgrimage, and like Dante in Purgatory, he keeps meeting ghosts from his past as he makes his way around the Purgatorial Mountain. And many of those ghosts are people murdered during the Troubles that he knew. And the reason I gave you the image of Manfred is that he meets a Manfred figure in one of the most extraordinary moments of the poem at all. And I want to sort of read this to you as it's hard for us to think about the Troubles in Ireland. People were afraid, actually, after Brexit, that it would all crop up again, because there would now be, once again, a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. But it was pretty bad in the 1970s and the 1980s. And this is part, this is in some way the equivalent in Irish life, in Heaney's life, of the wars among the city-states in Dante's time. So there was a man whom he knew. His name was William Streatham, who was a shopkeeper. And it was late at night, and Streatham was in his bed with his wife. They were upstairs in the bedroom, and there was a knocking at the door. And in those days, when there was a knock at the door in the middle of the night, he didn't open it. But he did, and was immediately shot, mistaken as an IRA operative. Heaney, who knew him, meets his ghost at Station Island. And this is how it works. I'll read it to you. Number 7. First, he was interviewed about this. I forgot my goodness. What he said was, I needed to bump my way through a blockage, a pileup of hampering stuff, everything that had gathered up inside me because of the way I was both in and out of the Northern Ireland situation. You can see why he was attracted to Dante, who was both in and out of Italian politics and the wars. I wasn't actively involved, yet I felt dragged upon and put upon by it. Dante was the first mover of the sequence, no doubt about that. The experience of reading him in the 1970s was mighty, and translating a very famous episode in the Inferno, the Ugolino episode, was like doing press-ups, which I take as Irish for push-ups, okay? Getting ready for something bigger. And that's what Station Island is. One of the ghosts he meets is James Joyce, the great Irish novelist. And he has Joyce say to him this, Joyce is sort of becomes like the Virgil who takes around. Yeah, Joyce says to Heaney, the main thing is to write for the joy of it. And don't be so earnest. Let others wear the sackcloth and the ashes. Let go. Let fly. Forget. You've listened long enough. Now strike your note. Now strike your note. That's one of the great ghosts that he meets. But he also meets the ghost of William Streeter, of the man who was shot in his door. And here's how it goes. It's number 7 on your sheet. I had come to the edge of the water, soothed by just looking, idling over it as if it were a clear barometer or a mirror. When his reflection did not appear, but I sensed a presence entering into my concentration on not being concentrated as he spoke my name. And though I was reluctant, I turned to meet his face. And the shock is still in me at what I saw. I'll stop for a minute. What I love about this is that the voice, the poet, is staring into the water and seeing his own face like Narcissus. Like, I've got, it's just me. And he feels a presence behind him. Very much like the men walking to Emmaus after the resurrection. They feel a presence behind them. Okay. So, and though I was reluctant, I turned to meet his face. And the shock is still in me at what I saw. His brow was blown open above the eye, and blood had dried on his neck and cheek. Easy now, he said, it's only me. You've seen men as raw after a football match. What time it was when I was wakened up, I still don't know. But I heard this knocking, and it scared me, like the phone in the small hours. So I had the sense not to put on the light, but looked out from behind the curtain. For one thing, by the way, you notice the structure of this, it's terza rima. He's writing it in the same 3-line stanzas that Dante would. I saw 2 customers on the doorstep and an old Land Rover with the doors open parked on the street. So I let the curtain drop. But they must have been waiting for it to move, for they shouted to come down into the shop. She started to cry, his wife, and rolled around the bed, lamenting to herself, not even asking who it was. Is your head astray, or what's come over you? I roared, more to bring myself to my senses than out of any real anger at her, for the knocking shook me, the way they kept it up, and her whinging and half screeching made it worse. All the time they were shouting, "Shop! Shop!" So I pulled on my shoes and a sport coat and went back to the window and called out, "What do you want? Could you quieten the racket or I'll not come down at all?" "There's a child not well. Open up and see what you've got. Pills or a powder or something in a bottle," one of them said. He stepped back off the footpath so I could see his face in the street lamp. And when the other moved, I knew them both. But bad and all as the knocking was, the quiet hit me worse. She was quiet herself now, lying dead still, whispering to watch out. At the bedroom door, I switched on the light. "It's odd they didn't look for a chemist. Who are they anyway? At this hour of the night," she asked me, with the eyes standing in her head. "I know them to see," I said. But something made me reach and squeeze her hand across the bed before I went downstairs into the aisle of the shop. I stood there, going weak in the legs. I remember the stale smell of cooked meat or something coming through as I went to open up. From then on, you know as much about it as I do. Did they say nothing? Nothing. What would they say? Were they in uniform, not masked in any way? They were barefaced as they would be in the day, Shites thinking they were the be-all and the end-all. Not that there's any consolation, but they were caught, I told him, and got jailed. Big-limbed, decent, open-faced. He stood forgetful of everything now except whatever was welling up in his spoiled head, beginning to smile. You put on a bit of weight since you did your courting in that big Austin you got the loan of on a Sunday night. Through life and death, he had hardly aged. There always was an athlete's cleanliness shining off him. And except for the ravaged forehead and the blood, he was still that same rangy midfielder in a blue jersey and starched pants. The one stylist on the team. The perfect, clean, unthinkable victim. Forgive the way I have lived indifferent. Forgive my timid, circumspect involvement, I surprised myself by saying. Forgive my eye, he said. Oh, that's above my head. And then a stun of pain seemed to go through him, and he trembled like a heat wave and faded. This is not a translation of Dante. This is in some ways, it's a tribute to Dante. And it's a kind of I would say in some ways it transfigures the poem. And the way that the speaker, who is Heaney and not Heaney? I mean, speakers of poems are always, you can't really identify with the poet artist, but this is Heaney. When he says, forgive the way I have lived indifferent, forgive my timid, circumspect involvement. Frankly, for those who heard the sermon tonight, I felt a little bit that way when I went back to talk to that guy from Venezuela. And with Heaney, it's all about not only his identity as a poet, but his identity as a citizen, and his identity as a cultural Catholic, at least. And so he uses this ancient incident when Dante the poet meets Manfred and recognizes the scar. He uses it to in some ways resurrect William Streatham as a way for him, Heaney, to figure out whether this exile from the Troubles is something that needs to end. If you read his, he won the Nobel Prize for poetry. It becomes a real theme of his whole life, of his whole writing life. Who am I writing for? Why am I doing this? What is, and to use an old-fashioned expression, what is my real calling? What is my real calling? So even though he's in some ways the most secular of poets, that is the most religious of questions. What is my calling? What am I called to do? What gifts have I been given? How do I use them? Joyce was pretty clear. Just go, just fly. But that sense of both here and not here, of being neither here nor there, goes right back to nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita mi ritrovai nella selva oscura. In the middle of my life journey, I found myself in a dark wood, in a thick thicket. My question would be, of course, well, why read this stuff? Well, because it speaks, I think. And to interpret verse like this, for me, is of a kind with interpreting a passage from Mark. What does it mean? What does it mean to the speaker? And only after that can you say that. What does it mean? Why is he saying it this way? Who is he talking to? How can this in some way shed light in my own selva oscura, in my own thick thicket, how do I ritrovai, how do I find myself? And for poets like Heaney, and for poets like Pinsky, and God bless her, Mary Jo Bang as well, the source for that is Dante. So maybe it will be for you. Thank you.
Are you willing to take any questions?
Sure.
For those who are at home, let's speak into this, please.
Okay. I have to say, this man is a former student of mine from 40 years ago.
Oh, and more than that.
Yeah, right,
1977,
Right,
78.
right. Amazing.
He was really good, by the way. I guess my question is, you pointed out that Dante is
You got it? Okay.
Dante is living amongst the horror of what Italian Italian politics at that time. Very bloody. Longfellow is translating right out of the Civil War. Heaney is amidst the troubles. In what sense was Dante prompted to write, this poem, or these poems, out of that sort of experience? Is that how relevant is that?
Absolutely relevant. Although we don't know much about. We know where he went. We know that basically he took refuge in various sympathetic courts. If you read the poem, you realize it is full of political judgments, particularly about Florence. So it's very much a part of how he understood himself. But he also understood himself as, I think of him as a lay theologian. That he had absorbed basically Thomas Aquinas. That was his theologian. And so in many ways, it's, how to put it, you could get yourself tripped up by thinking it's all about theology. No, it's really about human conflict and human love.
And which poet or poets is he coming to terms with
Virgil.
writing? Virgil.
The Aeneid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The
I mean, he has Virgil as a character in his poem.
Yep. That's what I thought.
Yeah. I mean, Virgil. But what's fascinating about Virgil in this poem is so wonderful. Virgil takes them all the way through the Inferno, and he takes them up the Purgatorial Mountain, and then he has to leave him because Virgil never believed in Jesus. He didn't know about Jesus, so he had to go back. So it was a kind of a tragedy of the Virgilian guide. But yeah, it was Virgil's Aeneid. Not to mention Scripture. I mean, it's so full of scriptural resonances, including everything from the dark wood to finding yourself to and the resonance of the wounds, Manfred's wounds. So, yeah.
How long did it take to write this?
It's hard to know. Probably 15 years. He probably, the Inferno obviously was the first. It's funny, things weren't published in that. There was no printing press. But the way that we have now, scholars have now found, the earliest transmission of the poem, it turns out that in Bologna, they kept record books, census books, and property books. The other people educated with these accountants, scribes, and in order to protect the space so that no one would sort of put on another kind of property that didn't belong to them, they put Dante verses. And this is like soon after he died. So clearly it was being passed around. Fascinating. There's a wonderful guy who teaches Dante at University of Chicago. And he did all the research. He actually looked at these account books. So the name of his book is Accounting for Dante. Yeah.
Raise your hand, please.
So you obviously have included a number of translations here. Do you have any translation that you recommend for somebody who either hasn't read Dante or it's been since college?
For Inferno,
Yeah.
Pinsky. For Purgatorio, Merwin. And for Paradiso, Mandelbaum. How's that for an answer?
That's not what I was looking for. but
You asked.
So can you repeat those again?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Pinsky's Inferno is incredible. And it's on paperback, you can get it easy. So Robert Pinsky for the Inferno. W.S. Merwin, wonderful American poet. he did a Purgatorial translation, and it has the Italian on facing pages. So does Sapinski. So even if you don't know Italian, you can look at it and go, oh, wow, that's smarita, that's a great word. You know? And Paradiso, that's the hardest one to, you were saying, you gave up halfway through. Many of us had done that, gave up halfway through. But Alan Mandelbaum, who's a poet but also taught at University College at Berkeley, he translated all three, and his is great. But if you actually read Dorothy Sayers' mystery novels, in the 1940s, she translated all of them. So if you could, the Penguin Dante is Dorothy Sayers, who also, Gaudy Night, a couple others. She's a great history writer. Yeah. We done? Oh, one more.
This is not a question, but in listening to you read the Italian, what I'm struck by is because the Italian, from what I saw here, the words end in a vowel.
Yeah.
So the meter that you have has a certain lilt to it,
Yep.
which really draws you in.
Yep.
But the English does not.
And that's why you have to find an English equivalent, because we don't end with vowels.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, it's easier to rhyme in Italian than it is in English, which is why many of them don't do rhymes. Yeah, so you hit it. To find the equivalent to that kind of music, you need somebody like Eni.
Who now, American, international, who has a religious imagination? Is there a poet with a religious imagination in the last 50 years, or maybe even writing now, that you are particularly drawn to?
Christian Wyman.
Christian Wyman, yeah, sure.
Yeah, Christian. He just has a new book out. Christian Wyman is a very interesting character. Grew up in Texas, not the way you grew up in Texas, okay? But he's written some remarkable poems, some remarkable religious essays. But he has lived his life with a horrible blood cancer. So he's always in pain. He's in and out of it, in and out of it, in and out of it. For many years, he was the editor for Poetry Magazine, but then I understood he actually wanted to teach. He actually approached, you might know Joe Baumgartner at Wheaton. He actually approached and said, give me a job at Wheaton. I need to be in a place. So he's actually now at the Yale Divinity School. And he's teaching this kind of thing at Yale Divinity School. But the new book is kind of harrowing. It gives you you get thankful for health reading this book. But religiously, let me put it this, he's a ruthless religious writer. And he doesn't take any guff about religion. There's no sentimentality, whatever. Yeah, I would say Christian Wyman.
This man has given us so much of his time today.
Oh, thank you.
We're so grateful to have him. Why don't we offer our thanks once more and then let him go.
Thank you. How do I turn this thing off?